The air in the Ag Pro dealership hung thick and sweet with the smell of new beginnings. It was the scent of green and yellow paint still curing on sheet metal, of fresh rubber tires that had never touched dirt, of hydraulic fluid and diesel fuel sitting clean and hopeful in their reservoirs. It was the smell of money, or more accurately, the smell of credit. For Jedediah Stone, it was mostly just a place to get a part. He stood by the parts counter, a ghost in grease-stained overalls, his presence barely registering against the gleaming backdrop of the showroom. His hands, calloused and permanently etched with the black lines of engine grime, rested patiently on the worn formica. In his right hand he clutched a small, brittle piece of black rubber, a failed gasket from the hydraulic pump of his 1969 John Deere 4020. He'd been standing there for 10 minutes. The dealership's owner, Stan Gable, was holding court over by the main attraction, a brand new International Harvester 1066, a magnificent beast of a tractor, all sharp angles and bold red paint. It had a fully enclosed cab, tinted glass, and a chrome exhaust stack that rose toward the ceiling like a silver spear. Its tires were taller than a grown man's chest, and sitting at the polished oak desk in front of it, signing the last of the paperwork, was Richard Miller. Rich Miller was everything Jed was not. His jeans were clean, creased, his boots were scuffed for show, not from work. A large silver belt buckle in the shape of a Texas Longhorn, despite them being in central Iowa, cinched a fancy leather belt. He laughed, a loud booming sound that filled the showroom, as Stan slid another piece of paper in front of him. "Last one, Rich," Stan said, his voice slick with deference. "Just the final financing agreement with the bank." "Hell, Stan," Rich boomed, scrawling his name with a flourish. "At these corn prices, the bank ought to be paying me to take this thing off your hands. This ain't a purchase, it's an investment in the future of American agriculture." A few other farmers, loitering around the showroom, nodded in agreement. They looked at the 1066 with a mixture of awe and raw envy. They looked at Rich Miller like he was a prophet. Then their eyes would drift over to Jed, standing quietly at the parts counter, and their expressions would change to something between pity and mild contempt. Jed just needed his gasket. The spring planting window was tight this year, 1972, and the 4020 was his only real horsepower. His old Farmall M was fine for raking hay, and the Ford 8N could handle the garden, but the 4020 was the heart of his operation. It was the tractor his father had bought new. The last big purchase he made before the heart attack took him. Jed knew every bolt on it, every whine of the synchro range transmission, every cough of the big 6-cylinder diesel on a cold morning. He'd rebuilt the engine himself 2 winters ago. The tractor was a part of him. It was also paid for. Stan finally finished with Rich, clapping him on the back and offering him a fresh cup of coffee from the pot behind the counter. As he poured, his eyes flickered over to Jed, and a flicker of annoyance crossed his face. "Be with you in a minute, Jed," he said, his tone dismissive. He turned his attention back to Rich. "So you're all set. We'll have it delivered tomorrow morning." "Sounds good," Rich said, taking a sip of the coffee. He caught Jed's eye and a smirk played on his lips. He sauntered over, the new paperwork clutched in his hand like a trophy. "Still trying to keep that old museum piece running, are you, Stone?" Jed held up the broken gasket. "Just needs a new seal. She'll be good as new." Rich chuckled, shaking his head. "Good as new in 1969, maybe. Jed, you can't make money in the 70s with 60s iron. The world's moving on. This new 1066 has a turbo, 125 horsepower on the PTO, air conditioning, a radio. I can work 16 hours straight and not even break a sweat. How many hours can you last on that open station Deere before your back gives out and your ears are ringing?" "I manage," Jed said quietly. "Don't have a payment book to worry about, so I sleep pretty good at night. That helps with the back." The barb, soft as it was, landed. A slight flush crept up Rich's neck. The other farmers shifted uncomfortably. Debt was the quiet devil on every farmer's shoulder, the one you didn't talk about in polite company. Rich scoffed, recovering quickly. He waved the loan papers dismissively. "You gotta spend money to make money, Jed. It's called leverage. My banker loves me. He sees where things are headed." He turned to Stan, his voice swelling with bravado, projecting for the whole room to hear. This is just the start, Stan. With the price of corn going where it is, I'm looking at a 5-year plan. We're talking a whole new fleet. Another tractor like this one next year, a new 6-row planter, maybe one of them new gleaner combines. We're talking a whole operation pushing close to $1 million by 77. $1 million. The figure hung in the air, shimmering and impossible. The other farmers stared, their mouths slightly agape. It was an astronomical sum, a dream of empire built on black Iowa soil. Jed saw the gleam in their eyes, the dangerous cocktail of hope and greed that the bankers were pouring so freely these days. He saw Stan Gable practically drooling at the thought of the commissions. Jed just shook his head, a barely perceptible motion. He turned back to the parts counter as Stan, his business with Rich concluded, finally deigned to acknowledge him. "All right, what do you need?" Stan asked, his tone flat. "Hydraulic pump gasket," Jed said, pushing the brittle piece of rubber across the counter. "For a 4020, side console." Stan sighed, annoyed at the small-time request after closing the biggest deal of the month. He lumbered back into the cavernous parts warehouse, the sound of him rummaging through dusty metal bins echoing in the showroom. Rich gave Jed one last pitying look. "You take care now, Jed. Don't work too hard." He walked out the door, the bell above it jingling, and climbed into a shiny new Ford pickup. A moment later, Stan returned and slapped a small paper envelope on the counter. $3.50. Jed pulled a worn leather wallet from his back pocket, extracted 3 crumpled dollar bills and 2 quarters. He slid them across the counter, took the envelope, and tucked it carefully into his shirt pocket. He gave a slight nod. "Appreciate it, Stan." He walked out of the dealership, leaving the intoxicating smell of new paint and easy credit behind him. The spring air outside felt clean and honest. He didn't look back at the gleaming red tractor in the window. He had walked away from the talk of $1-million fleets and the crushing weight of the debt that would surely follow. He had his $3 part and a paid-for tractor waiting for him at home. For Jed, that was a better kind of wealth. Now, before we get into the grease and grit of what Jed was up against, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever known a man like Jed? A man who stuck to his guns with old iron while everyone else was chasing the new and shiny? A father, a grandfather, an uncle who knew how to weld a cracked frame and rebuild a carburetor with his eyes closed? Let me know in the comments below, because this is where the story truly begins. This is where a man's principles are tested not by talk in a showroom, but by mud and sweat and the relentless turning of the seasons. The drive back to his farm was a straight shot down 5 miles of gravel road. The dust kicked up by his old Chevy C10 settled on the new leaves of the corn just starting to poke through the fields on either side. He passed Rich Miller's place first. It was easy to spot. The house was a new ranch style, the barn was freshly painted, and the machine shed was a massive new Morton building, its steel roof gleaming in the afternoon sun. Jed could see the new 1066 already parked out front, a proud red monument to modern ambition. Jed's own farmstead, a quarter-mile down the road, was a different picture entirely. The house was a 2-story clapboard his grandfather had built, solid and unpretentious. The barn was a classic hip roof, its red paint faded to a soft rosy grey by decades of sun and snow. His machine shed was an old converted corn crib, its doors sagging slightly. To a stranger, it looked tired. To Jed, it looked like home. It looked solvent. He parked the truck next to the workshop, the gravel crunching under the tires. Inside, the 4020 sat waiting, its guts exposed. The heavy cast-iron hydraulic pump, the source of its ailment, was on the workbench, sitting in a shallow pan of used oil. The air in the shop smelled of metal and grease, a sharp, familiar perfume that always cleared his head. He took the new gasket from his pocket, laid it on a clean rag, and got to work. This was his sanctuary. Here, there was no talk of leverage or 5-year plans. There was only the problem and the solution, the tool and the hand. He methodically cleaned the mating surfaces of the pump housing, using a small wire brush and a can of brake cleaner to remove every trace of the old failed gasket and the grime that had accumulated over the years. His hands moved with an unhurried, practiced efficiency. He knew this machine. He understood its language of clicks, whirs, and vibrations. He carefully fitted the new gasket, coated it with a thin layer of Permatex sealant, and began the awkward process of reinstalling the pump. It was heavy, maybe 50 pounds, and had to be maneuvered deep into the tractor's transmission case, aligning the splined shaft with the drive gear by feel alone. It was a frustrating job that tested a man's patience. He scraped his knuckles twice, drawing blood, and muttered a curse under his breath that was immediately swallowed by the quiet of the shop. As he was torquing down the final mounting bolt, he heard it. A high-pitched whine that grew into a throaty roar. He paused, wrench in hand, and looked out the open workshop door. It was Rich Miller, driving his new 1066 down the county road. He wasn't going anywhere in particular, just driving it, showing it off. The sound of its turbocharged engine was alien and aggressive compared to the familiar deep-throated rumble of Jed's naturally aspirated deer. Jed's 10-year-old son, David, who had been playing with a toy tractor in the driveway, stopped and stared. His eyes were wide with wonder as the gleaming red machine thundered past, kicking up a plume of dust that drifted across their property line. "Wow," David breathed, looking from the new tractor back to the disassembled green one in the shop. "His is so big, Dad, and it's so shiny." Jed felt a familiar gentle ache in his chest. "It's new, son. Things are always shiny when they're new." "Can we get a new one someday?" David asked, his voice full of a child's simple, honest desire. "One with a cab and a radio." Jed wiped a smear of grease from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Our 4120 works just fine, David, and it's ours. We don't owe anybody a single dime for it." "That's worth more than a radio." David didn't understand. He just kicked at a loose piece of gravel, his shoulders slumped. Jed knew it was hard for a boy to see the virtue in old and paid for when new and exciting was roaring right past your driveway. The next Saturday, Jed went into town for supplies at the co-op. The place was buzzing. The talk, as always, was about the weather and the markets. But the main topic was Rich Miller. "Heard he got his corn planted in 3 days," said Old Man Hemlock, leaning against a sack of seed. "That new tractor just pulls that 6-row planter like it ain't even there." "My boy said he saw him out there at 10 o'clock at night," added another farmer, shaking his head in disbelief. "Said the lights on that cab are brighter than a car's. He was just flying across the field." They all nodded, a current of admiration running through the group. Jed loaded his sacks of feed into the back of his truck, listening. No one spoke to him directly about it, but he could feel their thoughts. He was the cautionary tale, the man being left behind. His stubbornness, his refusal to get with the times, was becoming a local legend of the wrong sort. They saw him as a relic, as predictable and slow as the old tractor he insisted on driving. He was Jed Stone, the man who thought saving was better than spending, a fool in a boom time. He just paid for his feed, nodded to the men, and drove home, the weight of their judgment heavy in the cab of his truck. That spring was a wet one. The rain came in sheets, turning the fields into impassable swamps of black mud. The windows for planting were terrifyingly small, a day here, maybe 2 there, between storms. It was a race against the calendar. Rich Miller, with his powerful new tractor and big equipment, capitalized on every dry hour. His 4-wheel drive assist and high horsepower allowed him to work in conditions that would have buried Jed's 4020 up to its axles. Jed had to wait. He watched the sky, studied the barometer on his wall, and felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach with every passing day. When a 2-day dry spell finally arrived, he went to work with a desperate fury. He was in the tractor seat before the sun was up and stayed long after it had set, the old tractor's headlights cutting a weak yellow path through the darkness. On the second night, just as he was finishing his last field, the engine sputtered and died. He sat there in the sudden, ringing silence, the smell of raw diesel filling the air. He knew the problem instantly, a clogged fuel filter. It was a simple fix, but it would take an hour he didn't have. Rain was forecast for midnight. He climbed down from the seat, his body aching with fatigue, and fumbled for his tools in the dark. As he worked by the light of a flickering flashlight, his hands clumsy with exhaustion, he could see the bright, powerful lights of Rich Miller's 1066 working on the horizon, devouring acres in the night, its radio no doubt playing a cheerful tune. It was a lonely, bitter feeling. He got the filter changed and the engine restarted with only minutes to spare before the first drops of rain began to fall, fat and cold, against the windshield of his mind and the hot metal of the engine hood. He had won the battle, but he felt like he was losing the war. The next year, 1973, everything changed. The rain that had been a curse became a blessing. It fell at the right times, in the right amounts. The corn shot up out of the ground, dark green and vigorous. And then came the news that sent shockwaves through the farm belt. The Russians were buying American grain, unprecedented amounts of it. The price of corn, which had hovered around $1.50 a bushel, exploded. It shot past $2, then $2.50. By harvest time, it was pushing $3. A wave of unbelievable, intoxicating prosperity washed over the heartland. For the first time in a generation, it felt like the farmer was king. The government, led by Agriculture Secretary Earl Butz, was telling them to tear out their fence rows, to drain their wetlands, to plant fence row to fence row. Get big or get out. The future was here, and it was golden. For Rich Miller, it was the ultimate vindication. His huge bet had paid off in a way no one could have imagined. The profits from that one harvest were staggering. He did exactly what he said he would. He paid down enough of his loan to get the banker to extend him an even bigger line of credit. Before the snow fell that winter, he bought the old Henderson place, the 160 acres that bordered Jed's farm to the west. And he didn't stop there. He traded the year-old 1066 for a brand-new, bigger 1466 and bought a massive four-wheel drive Steiger Bearcat, a green articulated monster that looked like it could pull the entire barn off its foundation. He built new grain bins, tall silver silos that dominated the skyline. He drove into town in a new Lincoln Continental, his wife beside him wearing a fur coat. He was the embodiment of the new agricultural boom, a hero of progress. Jed had a good year too, the best of his life. The money that flowed into his bank account was more than his father had seen in a decade. His wife, Sarah, started circling things in the Sears catalog, a new color television, a new dishwasher. David dreamed of a new 10-speed bicycle. But Jed was cautious. The suddenness of the boom felt unnatural to him, like a fever. He'd seen his father ride out the ups and downs, and he knew that what went up could come down just as fast, and usually faster. So he didn't buy a new tractor. He didn't buy more land. Instead, he took a trip to the bank and wrote a check that paid off the last remaining $10,000 on his farm's mortgage. He handed the check to the banker, Mr. Harrison, and felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. The farm was his, free and clear, every acre, every building, every last nail. He used the rest of the money to put a new steel roof on the barn, to buy Sarah that dishwasher, and to put $20,000 into United States savings bonds. The rest went into a simple passbook savings account, earning a meager 5% interest. In the feverish atmosphere of the boom, Jed's actions were seen as bizarre, almost cowardly. Paying off a low-interest mortgage when you could be leveraging that equity to buy more land that was appreciating by the day. Putting cash in a savings account when new iron could double your productivity. It didn't make sense to anyone. He was a man using a bucket to bail out his rowboat in the middle of a tidal wave of cash. The gulf between the Stones and the Millers became a chasm. While the Millers went on a vacation to Florida, the Stones stayed home and re-shingled the porch roof. While Rich bought a new snowmobile, Jed taught David how to weld. The community saw it all. They saw a man soaring into the future and another man stubbornly clinging to the past. That winter, at the annual County Farmers Association banquet, Rich Miller was named Progressive Farmer of the Year. He stood at the podium in a new suit, beaming under the lights of the VFW hall. "Friends, neighbors," he began, his voice smooth and confident. "These are amazing times, but they are not times for the timid. The future belongs to those who aren't afraid to invest in it, to those who aren't afraid of growth. We have to seize this opportunity, to build operations that will feed the world for generations to come. We can't do that with yesterday's tools or yesterday's thinking." The applause was thunderous. Jed and Sarah sat at a table in the back, picking at their chicken dinners. Jed could feel the eyes of the other farmers on him. He wasn't just being ignored, he was being made an example of. He was the yesterday's thinking Rich was talking about. He was debt-free, more financially secure than he had ever been in his life, yet in that room, surrounded by his peers, he felt like a failure. Later that night, standing on his front porch, Jed looked out across the moonlit snow. In the distance, he could see the blinking red lights on top of Rich Miller's new grain elevators. He could hear the low, constant hum of the electric drying fans, running even in the dead of winter, preserving the golden harvest that was making his neighbor a king. Everything in him, every farmer's instinct, screamed that this wasn't sustainable. The price of land was skyrocketing. The cost of equipment was inflating, and the banks were handing out money like it was candy at a parade. He pulled a copy of Farm Journal from the mailbox earlier that day. Tucked away in the back, past the glowing articles about new mega combines and record yields, was a small piece. It was about the Federal Reserve, about a man named Paul Volcker, and about the growing concern over runaway inflation. It mentioned the possibility of raising interest rates to cool down the economy. The words were dry, academic, but they sent a chill down Jed's spine that had nothing to do with the winter air. He looked over at the blinking red lights of his neighbor's empire, at the monument built on soaring prices and easy credit, and a deep, unsettling feeling settled in his gut. The boom felt too hot, too fast, it felt fragile, and he knew, with a certainty that was as solid as the frozen earth beneath his feet, that a reckoning was coming. The years that followed were a blur of gold. The price of corn stayed high, the rains came when they were needed, and the mood in the heartland was one of invincible optimism. By 1978, Rich Miller's operation was a sprawling empire. He farmed nearly 2,000 acres, most of it rented, all of it worked with a fleet of machinery that looked like it belonged on a different planet. The Steiger Bearcat now pulled a massive 24-row planter, a piece of equipment so wide it had to be folded by a complex series of hydraulic cylinders just to get it down the road. Jed would watch it from his fence line, a mechanical leviathan unfolding its wings, and feel a sense of profound unease. It was too big. It was too complicated. Jed's life remained largely unchanged. He still farmed his original 240 acres with the 40/20. He had replaced the worn-out disc with a good used one he'd bought for cash at a farm sale, and he'd finally broken down and bought a small grain truck, a 10-year-old International Lodestar, so he wouldn't have to rely on the co-op's trucks during the harvest rush. His savings account grew steadily, quietly. In the eyes of his neighbors, he was a stubborn old fool, a man who had missed the boat, but Jed felt a quiet sense of security that was more valuable to him than any new tractor. The first sign of trouble was not in the markets, but in the sky. The summer of 1980 was brutal. A high-pressure system parked itself over the Midwest and refused to move. The rain simply stopped. The sun beat down with a merciless intensity day after day, week after week. The corn, which had shot up tall and green in the spring, began to suffer. The broad leaves curled in on themselves, a defensive posture against the relentless heat, turning a sickly pale green. The tassels, meant to be full of life-giving pollen, emerged scorched and brittle. For Jed, it was a time of deep anxiety. He walked his fields every evening, the dry soil crunching under his boots like broken glass. He could do nothing but watch and wait and pray. But his risks were contained. His yields would be poor, but his costs were low. He would survive. For Rich Miller, the drought was a catastrophe. His entire operation was built on the assumption of maximum yield. His massive monthly payments to the bank and the equipment dealers were predicated on $3 corn and 200 bushel an acre yields. Anything less, and the delicate financial house of cards would begin to wobble. He became a fixture on the gravel roads, driving his air-conditioned Lincoln from one parched field to another, a grim, desperate look on his face. The real blow came that fall. The harvest was a disaster across the Corn Belt. Yields were down by half, and then the other shoe dropped. In response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, President Carter announced a grain embargo. The Russians, the very buyers who had created the boom, were now cut off. The market panicked. The price of corn, which had held steady for years, plummeted. It fell through $2.50, then $2. It was in a freefall with no bottom in sight. One afternoon in late September, Jed was in his workshop, replacing the bearings on his combine's main cylinder shaft. It was a dirty, tedious job, but one he knew how to do. He heard the roar of a diesel engine and looked up to see one of Stan Gable's service trucks pulling into Rich Miller's driveway across the road. A mechanic in clean overalls got out and walked over to the massive 1466 tractor, which was sitting idle with the hood up. Jed watched for a while. The mechanic shook his head, made a call on his two-way radio, and spent the rest of the afternoon taking things apart. The next day, the service truck was back, this time with a crane. They were lifting the engine out of the tractor. Jed couldn't stand it anymore. He wiped his hands on a rag and walked across the road. Rich was standing there, arms crossed, watching the procedure with a haunted look in his eyes. "Engine trouble?" Jed asked quietly. Rich flinched, startled. He looked at Jed, and for the first time, the arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, naked fear. "Turbo went out," he said, his voice hoarse. "Took the whole engine with it, sent metal shavings all through the system. They say the whole thing is shot. Have to get a remanufactured block from the factory in Moline." "That's tough," Jed said, and he meant it. Right in the middle of harvest. "Tough?" Rich let out a bitter, strangled laugh. "It's a $30,000 repair, Jed. 30,000. And it'll take 2 weeks to get the parts. I've got 1,200 acres of corn left to cut. The price is dropping every damn day, and my main horse is dead in the water." He kicked at a tire on the tractor, a gesture of pure, impotent rage. "This thing's only 5 years old. It's supposed to be the best. But when it breaks..." His voice trailed off. He didn't have to finish the sentence. "When it breaks, you can't fix it. You can only pay." Jed stood there for a moment. He looked at the crippled red machine, a symbol of progress now rendered useless by a single complex failure. He looked at Rich, a man who had been a king just a few months ago, now staring into an abyss. "Rich," Jed said slowly, "I'm almost done with my beans. I've only got 80 acres of corn. I could be done in 2 days. If you want, I could bring my combine over. It's not big and it's not fast, but it runs." Rich stared at him, his expression a mixture of shock, disbelief, and shame. For years he had mocked Jed's old equipment, his small-time operation. Now that same small-time farmer was offering him a lifeline. The offer hung in the air between them, a profound and terrible kindness. Rich shook his head. I can't ask you to do that, Jed." "You're not asking. I'm offering," Jed said simply. He turned and walked back toward his own farm, leaving Rich standing alone beside the hollowed-out shell of his magnificent machine. The winter of 1981 was cold and bleak, a perfect reflection of the mood in the farm country. The news from the Federal Reserve was grim. To fight the double-digit inflation that was crippling the nation, Chairman Paul Volcker had raised the prime interest rate to an unheard-of 21.5%. For farmers like Rich Miller, who held massive variable-rate loans, it was a death sentence. The letters from the bank started arriving in January. First, they were polite inquiries, then they became firm demands. By March, they were notices of foreclosure. The numbers were simply impossible. Rich's loan payments had tripled, while his income had been cut in half. The land he had bought for $4,000 an acre just a few years before was now worth less than $2,000, its value collapsing as fast as the price of corn. He was upside down, buried under a mountain of debt he could never hope to repay. The community, which had once celebrated his ambition, now watched his downfall with a kind of morbid, fearful silence. They were all feeling the squeeze. Foreclosure auction notices began appearing in the local paper like obituaries. The shiny new equipment that had filled the dealerships just a few years earlier was now being sold off on courthouse steps for 10 cents on the dollar. Stan Gable's AgPro dealership, once the bustling heart of the boom, was a ghost town. The showroom was half empty, and Stan's face was a permanent mask of grey anxiety. Jed, meanwhile, was solvent. The low prices hurt, but they didn't threaten him. He had no loan payments. His property taxes were manageable. He heated his home with wood he cut from his own timber. He and Sarah had a large garden, and their cellar was stocked with canned goods. They were living like their grandparents had, tightening their belts, making do, and waiting for the storm to pass. His frugality, once a source of mockery, was now his salvation. He drove his old 4020 to town for a hydraulic hose. He passed the Miller farm and saw Rich out in the yard, loading tools into the back of his pickup. The big Steiger was gone. The new grain bins stood empty, their silver sides streaked with rust stains. A large professionally printed sign was staked into the front lawn. It read, "Farm Auction, Saturday, April 10th. Miller Farms, a complete dispersal." Jed felt a profound sadness. It wasn't a feeling of victory or vindication, it was the sorrow of seeing a neighbor, a fellow farmer, broken by the very system that had promised him the world. He had seen this before in the stories his father told of the Great Depression. He never thought he would see it again in his own lifetime. On the day of the auction, the sky was a low, oppressive sheet of grey. A cold spring wind whipped across the yard, snapping the flags on the auctioneer's truck and chilling the 200 or so farmers who had gathered to witness the end of an empire. They were like vultures, but sad vultures, picking over the bones of a fallen brother, hoping to find a bargain that might help them survive their own struggles. Rich Miller and his wife stood on the porch of their new ranch house, which would also be sold by the bank. They looked hollowed out, aged 10 years in 10 months. Rich's eyes were vacant, staring out at the crowd as the auctioneer began to chant, selling off his life, piece by piece. The shop tools went first, then the wagons, the planters, the discs. The prices were heartbreakingly low. Jed stood at the back of the crowd, his hands in his pockets, his face grim. He wasn't there for a bargain, he was there to bear witness. Finally, the auctioneer moved to the main event, the land. "All right, folks, here we go. We're selling 160 acres, known locally as the Old Henderson Place. Prime, flat, black ground. Who'll start the bidding at $1,000 an acre?" The bidding was sluggish. No one had money. The bankers in the crowd, men in suits and clean boots, kept their hands in their pockets. They already owned too much land they couldn't sell. "1,000 I have, now 1,100. Will you give me 11? The auctioneer chanted. Slowly the price crept up. 1,100, 1,200. It stalled at 1,250. Jed saw Rich flinch. He had paid nearly 4,000 an acre for this land. 1,250 once, 1,250 twice, the auctioneer cried, his voice desperate. Sold at $1,250 an acre to 1,300, a quiet voice said from the back of the crowd. Every head turned. It was Jed Stone. A murmur went through the crowd. What was he doing? Where did he get that kind of money? A man from the bank, who had been bidding, looked annoyed. 1,350, he counted. 1,400, Jed said, his voice calm and steady. He hadn't moved. He just stood there, a quiet man in clean but faded overalls. The banker conferred with his colleague. He shook his head. He was at his limit. The auctioneer looked at Jed. 1,400 once, 1,400 twice. Fair warning. He slammed his gavel down. Sold for $140 for $1,400 an acre to Mr. Jedediah Stone. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Jed had just paid $224,000. In cash. The savings bonds he'd bought in the good times, the cash he'd squirreled away while others were buying new pickups and snowmobiles, it was all going into this. He walked forward to sign the papers, his face unreadable. He didn't stop there. When the 1466, now with a new engine but still bearing the scars of debt, came up for sale, Jed bought it. The bidding was weak. It was too big, too complex for most of the survivors. He got it for a fraction of its worth. He also bought Rich's toolbox, the big red Kennedy box full of snap-on wrenches and sockets that he knew Rich cherished. When the auction was over and the crowd began to disperse, leaving the Miller family alone in the wreckage of their dreams, Jed walked over to the porch. He held out a set of keys. They were the keys to the 1466. Rich looked at him, his face a mask of confusion and shame. What? What is this? It's your tractor, Jed said. I'm going to need someone to farm that new ground I just bought. And I'll need someone to help me with my own crop. I'm getting too old to do it all myself. I'll pay you a fair custom rate. And the tractor, you can lease it back from me. $1 a year. For as long as you need it. Rich's wife began to cry, silent tears streaming down her face. Rich stared at the keys, then at Jed, his eyes welling up. The pride, the arrogance, the rivalry. It all melted away, leaving only the raw, humbling reality of the moment. He was a broken man, and the person he had mocked and belittled for a decade was the only one offering him a hand up. "Why, Jed?" Rich whispered, his voice cracking. "After everything, why?" Jed looked out over the fields, the land that had broken one man and sustained another. "Because we're neighbors," he said, "and that's supposed to mean something." He pressed the keys into Rich's hand along with the key to the toolbox. "Your tools," he said. "A man needs his tools." He turned and walked away, leaving the Miller family on the porch, holding the small metal seeds of a second chance. He didn't look back. He didn't need the applause or the thanks. His vindication wasn't in his neighbor's failure, but in his own quiet ability to help. It was in the simple, profound fact that on the worst day of his neighbor's life, he was strong enough to be kind. The years that followed were lean, but they were not desperate. The farm crisis of the 1980s reshaped the American heartland, leaving deep scars. Many families lost their farms, their heritage wiped out in a storm of bad debt and bad prices. But the Stones endured. Jed and Rich worked the land together. The arrangement was quiet and unspoken. Rich, humbled and hard-working, farmed Jed's new acres and his own small remaining plot with the 1466. Jed continued to use his trusted 40-20. They became an odd but effective team. The talk in the community changed. Jed Stone was no longer the stubborn fool. He was the wise man, the one who had seen the storm coming when everyone else was still admiring the sunshine. He was the man who had understood that the real foundation of a farm wasn't in the size of its equipment, but in the smallness of its debt. One crisp autumn afternoon in the late 80s, Jed was in the workshop, watching his son, David, now a tall, capable young man of 25. David was bent over the engine of the 40-20, carefully adjusting the valve lash, his hands moving with the same practiced confidence that Jed's had for so many years. The old tractor was on its third engine overhaul, its green paint was faded and chipped, the seat was cracked and the fenders were dented, but it ran as strong as ever. David finished his work and wiped his hands on a rag, the gesture a mirror image of his father's. He looked at the old tractor, then looked at his dad, who was leaning against the workbench. "You know, Dad," David said, a small smile on his face, "I was at the dealership the other day. Stan Gable's son runs it now. He tried to sell me on one of the new ones, $600,000. It has a GPS that steers itself and a computer screen bigger than our first TV." "What did you tell him?" Jed asked, though he already knew the answer. "I told him I was pretty happy with the one we've got," David said. He patted the warm hood of the 40-20. "No payment book on this one. Sleeps pretty good at night." Jed smiled, a deep and satisfying warmth spreading through his chest. The words were the same ones he had spoken in that showroom all those years ago, but now they were coming from his son, spoken not as a defense, but as a statement of core belief. The lesson had been passed down, the legacy was secure. It wasn't just the land, free and clear, it was the wisdom. He looked around the workshop, at the familiar smell of grease and steel, at the old tractor that had been his steadfast partner through boom and bust, at the son who now understood its true value. He thought of Rich Miller, who had managed to buy back a small part of his farm and was making a new life, a smaller but more stable one. He thought of the quiet respect he now received in town, a respect earned not with bravado and credit, but with patience and prudence. The world had moved on, chasing bigger, faster, and more expensive dreams. But here, in the quiet heart of his farm, Jedediah Stone had held his ground, and in doing so, had saved everything that mattered.